director of Payload, and I'm so excited for this keynote discussion today on what role the national security community plays in protecting some of the off-world, up-and-coming off-world capabilities that this symposium is talking about. Joining us for this discussion is Lieutenant General John Shaw. If he looks different to some of you, it might be because you don't recognize him in civilian clothes. Today is actually his first day of retirement after a 30-plus year military career. So before his retirement, he most recently served as the Deputy Commander of U.S. Space Command. So, sir, a hearty congratulations to start off with, and just thank you so much for joining us today on your first day off.
Well, thanks, Jacqueline. Can you hear me okay there in the audience?
I think we're good.
All right. No, great to be here. I wish I could have been there in person, but glad I could join you this way. And by the way, this is a whole lot more comfortable than the usual uniform I wear.
So to start off with, I'm hoping you can sort of set the scene for us about kind of the national security threat landscape in space today. What are the current threats to assets and missions in orbit as you see them?
Yeah, Jacqueline, hey, I think a good place to start is, why are there threats to begin with? Why are we even talking about, why is this fireside chat even part of the agenda of Beyond Earth, right? Some might say it seems a little out of place. We had all these motivating, extremely exciting panels before, and then we got a lot coming the rest of today and then tomorrow. And then you got this guy named Shaw who's going to talk about military stuff in space. It seems to some, it might seem incongruous. And I think my overarching message would be, it's not. Security issues follow human activities no matter where they go. And I'm not here to throw cold water on the ideas of Beyond Earth. I'm one of its biggest enthusiasts. I just realized that, I think we should all realize that humans don't go places without bringing all their issues with them, and that includes security issues. And so, as I'm fond of saying, you may not be interested in space security, but space security is interested in you. And so we all probably need to consider that. To get more specific on your question, Jacqueline, the kinds of threats, I mean, we don't have much time. I don't want to spend too much time on those, but they cover the full spectrum of threats that are analogous to what you would see in any other domain. They are natural hazards. They are navigational hazards caused by humans, probably being a little less responsible than they should be. This happens in every domain. And then there are, no kidding, intentional threats from various actors, anywhere from non-state actors to state actors. And again, for various reasons that usually have to do with competition in the domain and competition that, of course, extends downward into the terrestrial spheres. Another thing I'm fond of saying is all astropolitics is terrestrial. So we won't be seeing anything happening in space that isn't being driven by geopolitical forces on the Earth's surface, at least for the foreseeable future. So anyway, again, the threats range from natural to unintentional to intentional, electromagnetic to intentional kinetic, and everything in between.
So moving on to talk a little bit about kind of how the Space Force is preparing to respond to all those threats, I feel like we often hear in a lot of Pentagon reports about how the Pentagon is preparing, specifically to respond to some of the kinetic and non-kinetic threats you talk about. But so hoping you can talk a little bit about how the Space Force and the Pentagon are responding to that. But I'm also interested in how the Defense Department is preparing for some of these natural threats. I feel like it's something that we hear a little bit less about.
So, well, the first one, the number one goal for Space Force and U.S. Space Command, which ultimately employs the capabilities that Space Force and other services bring forward, is to deter any kind of nefarious activity in space, anywhere from mischief to outright conflict. And the way we that's really, I think, the primary focus on how we're preparing to do that, to get a better idea of what's going on in space from space domain awareness capabilities, to then be able to respond to those quickly and to make our own capabilities less vulnerable to threats and therefore deter any action against them. I'd like to point out that the main reason that potential adversaries of ours are developing counter space capabilities to come after our space capabilities is because we use them so much. Our joint warfighter relies on them, and our human society relies on them. And so again, we shouldn't be surprised, like many other domains, Now they're seen as a potential target by a potential adversary. So again, the number one focus in preparation is to deter, and doing that by increased awareness, increased resilience, and being prepared to respond to any kind of activity in the domain. I think you asked another question about natural hazards too, and about a broader spectrum. And I'll just say that, Space Force is not trying to do any of this all by itself. We want to be part of an interagency and an international solution set on addressing all of those concerns, anywhere from the establishment of norms of behavior, and you saw some of that in the previous panel. I didn't get a chance to listen to all of that, but I'm guessing Ken Hodgkins, whom I know from participating in some delegations in Vienna with him in the past, led a terrific panel in that regard. We need to do it together, interagency, internationally, as a team.
I want to tee up my next question very well. To build a little bit on the last panel, we obviously had representatives from multiple different countries talking about the importance of doing space together, not kind of trying to do it alone. But obviously there are, security and sharing concerns in the military. So what role do allies play in terms of protecting space and working with the national security space enterprise?
Well, I think they're critical in today's environment in space. When we think back to what I call the first space age, which was really the Cold War, and we think about Apollo and the early national security satellite systems that we had, it was largely bilateral. It was us and the Soviet Union, and that's just how things started. And that was almost a sort of a false paradigm that we sort of thought about. That's how we thought about space. We can't think about it that way anymore. Space is everybody's. It's for the entire planet, and its future is going to be for all humans. And so we have to do these things internationally. I did catch about most of that last panel. I thought it was a terrific discussion. I agreed with everything that our friends from our allied countries had to say. We need to do these things together. I'd like to point out that, as opposed to Apollo that I mentioned from the Cold War era, Artemis is an international endeavor. And kudos to NASA for building that in from the very, very beginning. And I think it sets a good model for the rest of us to realize, hey, we need to do things together in space moving forward.
Are there just a quick follow-up, any examples you can share of, times that, that you or, other senior military leaders worked with international governments, or any specific projects that, where there's been a lot of cooperation?
I could just say the momentum continues it's accelerating all the time. Momentum continues to build in working with our partners. 2 jobs I had to go where I worked at Vandenberg Space Force Base. I was the Combined Forces Space Component Commander. That's language in the Department of Defense that means that word combined. That means that is coalition. It's allies working together. And I had members from other nations on my staff and in my operational structure there. And the last job I had as Deputy Commander, U.S. Space Command, we were working more closely with allies than ever before. And even in the 3 years I was in that job, we saw some of our allies stand up their own space commands, to include Germany and France and the UK and Australia. And so it's just been, I guess my answer to you is it's a wave of building momentum of realization and normalization on how we need to work together in the space domain the same way we work together in an allied and combined way in the terrestrial domains.
So going back a little bit to kind of the Space Force's core mission, obviously you say it's to deter and prevent and respond to, if needed, conflict in space. But when the service was forming, there was a lot of talk about kind of the need to have people thinking about, warfighting in the space domain. And while there have been a lot of parallels drawn to the sea, commercial ships at sea that the Navy would protect from bad actors, space is obviously very unique and works somewhat differently. So I'm curious if you can share a little bit about, now that the service is a couple years old, how the Space Force is kind of wrestling with this idea of warfighting doctrine in a domain that is as unique as space.
Yeah, I think it's actually a twofold approach that's sort of a dialectic, if you will. The first is realizing that warfighting in space actually does have a lot of similarities to warfighting in other domains. You've already heard me say that a little bit already today. It's like things will happen in space like they do in other domains, policy-wise, operations-wise, and when it comes to conflict. But the other half of that dialectic is, as you said, pointed out, it is absolutely a different physical domain, different physical rules, and we can't copy paste everything we do in the other domains into space. I think so as we're thinking about how we will warfight in the domain, it's driven by how will we organize, how will we command and control, what will the ROE be that's delegated down to other commanders? Again, these are similar to the ways we work in other domains. And then how will we need our capabilities to develop specifically intended to support possible combat operations? So let me just diverge just a little bit on that, on what I mean by that. So from the dawn of the space age, we've basically been conducting what I would call positional space operations. We put satellites in orbit and we keep them in relatively constant orbits. And they don't move a whole lot from those orbits. In fact, most of the energy we use over their lifetime is to sustain them in that particular orbit or that position in orbit. And that's actually, it's great to leverage the space domain that way for almost all of our commercial capabilities, for many of our civil capabilities, for almost anything that does some sort of Earth monitoring. But when it comes to actual combat maneuver in the domain, we probably are going to have to think a little bit differently. And we're going to have platforms that are actually going to be maneuvering and changing their energy state much, much more frequently than we've been accustomed to. So I just sort of use that as just a brief example here, Jacqueline, as how we're starting to think about how space combat might be different and what capabilities we may need to sustain maneuver in the domain. And we can look at a lot of analogies in the other domains that are along those lines, right? There's a difference between flying airliners from point to point where you know you're going to have fuel on the other end and you know you're going to be able to land in a benign fashion, or if you're conducting air operations in a contested environment, and now you probably need to maneuver a whole lot more, and you probably need some refuelers to get you ready to be optimally poised to be capable in a combat environment. So that's sort of starting to scratch the surface of how we're starting to think differently about that. I'd point out Teresa Hitchens had a pretty good article in Breaking Defense earlier this week where she kind of broke down the new Space Operations Doctrine document 3-14. So if anyone's looking for a little bit more of that, that might be your next best thing to go Google and take a look at.
Great, you're giving us homework here. So want to delve a little bit, obviously, this conference focuses so much on, the growing commercial and private space enterprise. What is the Defense Department's responsibility to respond to either, man-made attacks or natural disasters that affect economic or private activity in orbit?
Yeah, so I think we're just starting to scratch the surface on a lot of this, and we will dive deeper as a society, as a planet. I should point out that right now, the mission set that is given to U.S. Space Command from the president actually includes, when directed, protecting not only military space capabilities, but also commercial space capabilities. So that's already part of the foundation of something we need to be thinking about what we will do. And as humans themselves venture more into space, the Department of Defense and Space Force and Space Command are going to be there to provide security and transparency to those operations. Let me just start with the obvious, right? When the Department of Defense has been supporting human spaceflight from the very beginning, from the Gemini and Mercury and Apollo era, we'll be doing the same. When Artemis goes back to the moon, we'll be supporting NASA with the best space domain awareness capabilities that we can to let them know, are there any hazards they need to be concerned about? We'll participate in recovery operations, just like we did for Apollo and like we will for Orion. But when humans go into space privately, and that will happen for commercial purposes or even for even private personal purposes, there will be some measure of dependence on the government for safety of those operations. We have yet to really define what those are. And most importantly, we have yet to equip the Space Force and the nation for many of those things. So your next question, or someone who's in the audience is already thinking, well, hey, so that means that if there's a space tourist that's now in danger in space because something's gone wrong, isn't it Space Force's responsibility to go rescue them? Well, you got to have some capability first to do it. But I think that will be something that will evolve. We do it in the other domains. It'll happen in the space domain too.
Given that, we are seeing private people fly to the International Space Station, we are seeing private astronaut flights, what sort of capabilities do you need? And, if someone had an emergency on a private space flight today, how would the Space Force respond? Like, what would be available today to respond to that?
Yeah, today it's going to be primarily space domain awareness, understanding what is going on, and trying to assess the threats to prevent those from happening in the first place. But that's largely what it is today. We don't have capabilities to actually get into the domain very quickly to go help. Now, we are working on responsive space capabilities writ large that allow us to very quickly put a payload into orbit, a capability in orbit to respond or to replenish capabilities on orbit or to augment them. Clearly, there would be that responsiveness factor would have a collateral benefit in terms of protecting other activities in space, including civilians.
I know when the OceanGate submersible disappeared, I read a lot kind of talking about drawing parallels to the space domain, where you have a handful of very wealthy people going to this very harsh and unforgiving domain. Do you see that as a fair comparison to sort of what the Space Force's response would be like to an accident like that today, and where do you see any differences?
Yeah, I actually think it's actually a really good example, because let's recall what happened with that incident, right? It was the Coast Guard wasn't on scene when this craft was diving, and there was kind of a built-in presumption they know what they're doing and it's routine operations. As soon as things started to go wrong, though, there's at least two things that happen. The first is, and if the audience will remember, the United States Navy actually provided some acoustic data that helped kind of locate and identify probably what had happened. That is directly analogous to space domain awareness data. What's going on? What did you see? And how can that be relevant to understanding the situation and or remediating the problem? And then, of course, the Coast Guard ultimately got engaged. They weren't on scene watching there the whole time, but once an emergency happened, then they engaged and brought the resources they could to be a potential help. In this case, it wasn't, but it could have been in a different scenario, right? I'll point out, as I talk to you from the mountains of Colorado out here, when I go hiking in Colorado, there's not a helicopter following me, making sure that I'm safe and coming to rescue me if anything goes wrong. But you can bet, if something were to go wrong and someone says an SOS from the mountains, yeah, there's going to be security forces that'll engage to try to effect a rescue. I think that's pointing the way to what we'll be doing, at least in the midterm, in the space domain.
We are almost out of time, but I want to ask you quickly before we wrap up to look a little bit farther out. When the Space Force was formed, the service was very, very careful to say it's not armed troops in orbit. I think, pushing back a little bit on some of the joking narrative that followed the service when it was initially established. But, talking about everything that's going to be happening in space, do you think that will be necessary at some point, and how far away do you think we are from that?
Well, let me talk the near to midterm, where our event horizon, so to speak, is. And it really is it's really the Earth-Moon system. You can't draw a bright line at geosynchronous and say nothing beyond that, because a whole lot of mischief can happen just beyond that in the Earth-Moon system. So the Space Force is looking really close at Cislunar today. Now, most of our focus is geo and below, because that's where our capabilities are, but we don't want to get behind, and we don't want to be surprised strategically by other activities or problems or hazards or threats that emerge within the Earth-Moon system. So what I'm telling you is I think you'll see a focus on that happening very, 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 it's happening today. And you'll see capabilities being applied for better awareness and maybe even for capabilities that are operating in the broader Earth-Moon system. So that's actually pretty exciting. And I think that will dovetail into a lot of what will be talked about in the symposium here today and tomorrow. For actual troops in space, probably not anytime soon, Jacqueline. We are able to do an awful lot with our robotic platforms, and that's probably going to be the main focus for Space Force in the near term. However, I will also say it's inevitable that you will see Space Force personnel further up in the gravity well and eventually beyond the Earth-Moon system in the longer term. And why is that? Because I resonate with the theme of this conference here. Humans are going to be there, and if humans go up the Earth beyond the Earth-Moon system, then you're going to have security issues, and you're going to need a force that can help with that security, and that's going to be Space Force. And I don't know if it'll be a bunch of single-person craft jetting around, or more. I think more likely, maybe command and control stations that have humans there, kind of to be there on site and making judgments and decisions. But one way or another, it's inevitable that we will have Space Force people beyond the Earth's surface.
Great. I think that's a great note to end on, to look at all of the protection that's going to be needed for everything we're going to be talking about the rest of today and tomorrow. So, sir, thank you so much for joining us virtually. I think I really enjoyed this conversation, and hopefully it will lay great groundwork for the conversations the rest of the symposium.
Okay, thanks, Jack.